Coast University, Leipzig Connection, Chapter 4, Mice and Monkeys. Working closely with Cattell, Russell began to hire faculty. One of his first chosen was Frank McMurray, who had also studied psychology at Leipzig. Active in the National Education Association and in the National Society for the Scientific Study of Education, of which his brother Charles McMurray was the executive secretary, he soon attracted the attention of James Russell. The result was that in the fall of 1898, he joined the Teachers College faculty. His own studies of the principles of the method of John Dewey emerged in 1907 in his book How to Study and Teaching How to Study, followed by many additional treatments of the same theme. His basic interest also extended to the curriculum of the elementary school. His teaching and writing in this realm quickly established him as a pioneer of modern progressive educational theory. It was the hiring by Russell of another practitioner of the new fad, however, that was to result in Columbia's becoming the connection for a fatal dose of Wundtian psychology into the main line of American education. Edward Thorndike was trained in the new psychology by the first generation of Wundtian proteges. He graduated from Wesleyan University in 1895 after having studied with Wundtians Armstrong and Judd. He went to graduate school at Harvard, studying under psychologist William James, a transitional figure whose later influence depended, to a substantial extent, on his subtle furthering of physiological psychology under the guise of pragmatism. While at Harvard, Thorndike surprised James by doing research with chickens, testing their behavior, and pioneering what later became known as animal psychology. We're going to pause for a second here and talk about pragmatism. Not only are we going to deal with pragmatism, but we're also going to deal with physiological. And physiological is basically any way in which your body reacts to something, right? The inward ways in which your body reacts. And I'm going to go down a long list of physiological ways in which these people studied you, or the signs in which your body showed them that you were having a reaction to the stimuli that they provided. And so also here we have relating to the way in which a living organism or body part functions. And then when you add in pragmatism, you end up with an approach that assesses the truth of meaning of theories or beliefs in terms of the success of their practical application. Pragmatism doesn't deal with the truth of the matter. Or perhaps there are better ways of doing things. But the pragmatic way is to say, hey, if you have success, then that's really all that matters. You achieved a goal and you showed the relationship between some things where it could be more nuanced than what you have it being. But if you can just prove your point, then maybe others will take that as the truth and your experiment was successful, or your way of explaining certain psychological reasons why something happened is that you can associate them with the physiological ways in which people reacted to the stimuli that you gave them. All right. And so here are the ways in chapter 2 that they became more introspective, is that they started adding introspection to the resources of the psychological or physiological laboratories. They attempted the minute analysis of sensation and perception. They measured reaction times, following their problems into numerous and widespread ramifications. They investigated verbal reactions, thus extending their research into the field of association. They measured the span and the fluctuations of attention and noticed some of its more complex features in the complication experiment, a laboratory method patterned after the situation that gave rise to the astronomer's problem of the personal equation. In their studies of feeling and emotion, they recorded pulse rates, breathing rates, and fluctuation in muscular strength. And even in the same connection, they developed methods of recording systematically and treating statistically the impressions observed by introspection. So, when you couple all that with the theory that you can prove what you're saying about psychology through the physiological reactions of someone, then you can move forward with teaching it to others and spreading it throughout the country. Okay? Which is pretty dangerous. Pragmatism made all this possible. If you can just prove correlation, then you have causation. All right? Which isn't necessarily true. Things can be more nuanced than just that. But, in the early goings, and then you can get a whole bunch of other alleged psychologists and physiological researchers to jump on your bandwagon, you can win over hundreds, thousands, and hundreds of thousands of people in a country. And then you can start to take over and change what psychology once was, from a study to the mind to a study of the body and mind together, which isn't necessarily terrible, but the mind should always come first. Continuing the reading. As briefly stated by Thorndike himself, psychology was the science of the intellect, character, and behavior of animals, including man. Thorndike applied for a fellowship at Columbia, was accepted by Cattell, and moved with his two most famous chickens to New York, where he continued his research and earned his Ph.D. in 1898. Thorndike's specialty was the puzzle box, into which he would put various animals, chickens, rats, cats, and let them find their way out by themselves. His doctoral dissertation on cats has become part of the classical literature of psychology. After receiving his doctorate, he spent a year as a teacher of education at Western Reserve University, and it wasn't long before Cattell advised Dean Russell to visit Thorndike's first classroom at Western Reserve. Although the dean found him dealing with the investigations of mice and monkeys, he came away satisfied that he was worth trying out on humans. Russell offered Thorndike a job at Teachers College, where the experimenter remained for the next 30 years. Thorndike was the first psychologist to study animal behavior in an experimental psychology laboratory, and following Cattell's suggestion, apply the same techniques to children and youths. As one result, in 1903, he published the book Educational Psychology. In the following years, he published a total of 507 books, monographs, and articles. We're going to go back and look at this stuff about how they want to compare humans to animals, which is just goofy, nuanced goofy. For real. Change of plan about going back. I'll address why humans are superior to animals after the chapter ends. Thorndike's primary assumption was the same as once, that man is an animal, that his actions are actually reactions, and that he can be studied in the laboratory in much the same way as an animal might be studied. Thorndike equated children with the rats, monkeys, fish, cats, and chickens upon which he experimented in his laboratory and was prepared to apply what he found there to learning in the classroom. He extrapolated laws from his research into animal behavior, which he then applied to the training of teachers, who took what they had learned to every corner of the United States and ran their classrooms, curricula, and schools on the basis of this new educational psychology. In the Principles of Teaching Based on Psychology, 1906, Thorndike proposed making the study of teaching scientific and practical. This is his definition of the art of teaching. The art of giving and withholding stimuli with the result of producing or preventing certain responses. In this definition, the term stimulus is used widely for any event which influences a person. For a word spoken to him, a look, a sentence which he reads, there he breathes, etc., etc. The term response is used for any reaction made by him, a new thought, a feeling of interest, a bodily act, any mental or bodily condition resulting from the stimulus. The aim of the teacher is to produce desirable and prevent undesirable changes in human beings by producing and preventing certain responses. The means at the disposal of the teacher are the stimuli which can be brought to bear upon the pupil. The teacher's words, gestures, and appearance, the condition and appliances of the schoolroom, the books to be used and objects to be seen, and so on through a long list of things and events which the teacher can control. These are the origins of conditioning, and the later work of behavioral psychologists such as Watson, who received his PhD from Dewey at the University of Chicago in 1903 with a thesis entitled Animal Education, and Skinner. Thorndike based conditioning on what he called the law of effect, which held that those actions and behaviors leading to satisfaction would be impressed or stamped in on the child, and those leading to unsatisfactory results would be stamped out. Thus, the only way to strengthen a child's good response is by reinforcing it, and the only way to eliminate a child's bad response is by denying it. This theory creates certain problems for the educator. Should the child, for example, not want to learn his multiplication, the teacher will have to find some way of making multiplication pleasurable and rewarding, or the child just won't learn it. Similarly, if the child enjoys tossing pencils at his classmates, he would have to be instructed. He would have to be instructed by denying him pleasure, that such a behavior isn't permissible. This thinking favors a society which operates more on the basis of gratification than on the basis of reason or responsibility. Children expect to receive what is pleasurable and what they desire because they have learned in school that what is pleasurable is good and what isn't pleasurable isn't good. This is an inheritance from the stimulus response teaching developed by Thorndike and transmitted to hundreds of thousands of teachers through the medium of educational psychology. Previously, of course, good behavior was considered its own reward. The idea of rewarding a child for behaving like a human being would only occur to someone who supposes that the child is basically an animal and would have seemed like an open invitation to blackmail to any sensible 19th century parent. What was the purpose of education according to Thorndike? Education is interested primarily in the general interrelation of man and his environment and all the changes which will make possible a better adjustment of human nature to its surroundings. This is also the view of Dewey and other Wundtians, that man is a social animal who must learn to adapt to his environment instead of learning how to ethically adapt the environment to suit his needs and those of society. Individualism and the developing of individual abilities give way to social conformity and adaptation. The product of education becomes well-adjusted, conditioned children. Thorndike also has specific views about education in the basics, 3 R's. Studies of the capacities and interests of young children indicate the advisability of placing little emphasis before the age of 6 upon either the acquisition of those intellectual resources known as the formal tools, reading, spelling, arithmetic, writing, etc., or upon abstract intellectual analysis. Despite rapid progress in the right direction, the program of the average elementary school is too narrow and academic in character. Traditionally, the elementary school has been primarily devoted to teaching the fundamental subjects, the 3 R's, and closely related disciplines. Artificial exercises like drills on phonics, artificial exercises like drills on phonetics, multiplication tables, and formal writing movements are used to a wasteful degree. Subjects such as arithmetic, language, and history include content that is intrinsically of little value. Nearly every subject is enlarged unwisely to satisfy the academic ideal of thoroughness. That the typical school overemphasizes instruction in these formula academic skills as a means of fostering intellectual resources is a justifiable criticism. Elimination of unessentials by scientific study, then, is one step in improving the curriculum. Thorndike was joining and furthering the demands of other psychologists that the traditional curricula could be radically changed and account with the principles of psychology. Besides de-emphasizing the study of the educational basics, he outlined what he considered to be the three main functions of the elementary school. Number one, to provide for each child 6 years of experience designed to enable him to make at each step in the period adjustments to the most essential phases of life. To adjust this general education to each child requires a considerable degree of specialization in accordance with individual differences. Consequently, the elementary school has a second function, namely, number two, to determine as accurately as possible the native intellectual capacities, the physical, emotional, temperamental, recreational, aesthetic, and other aptitudes of children. Since some pupils will find it necessary or advisable to enter a vocation in the middle teens, a third function is essential in some degree, namely, number three, to explore the vocational interests and aptitudes of pupils and to provide some measure of vocational adjustment for those who will leave school at the earliest legal age. Let's look at each of these three main functions. We have spoken about Thorndike's views on adjustment, on education as experience rather than as the development of skills that access abilities and individuality. The child, much like the animal, is what he has experienced, tempered by the type and condition of his brain and nervous system. If his nervous system is in good order, then the child will be able to respond properly to the stimuli to which he is exposed. It is, of course, in the child's earliest years that the nature of the stimuli is most important, and these will most influence his character and personality. Despite the careful control of stimuli and the conditioning of behavior, however, something might still go wrong. With all stimuli theoretically the same for a group of children, the continued difference in individual learning rates and abilities will indicate something psychologically different between youngsters. Hence, Thorndike's second point, psychological testing, is used to determine what the differences are. Testing each child regularly and thoroughly, in this view, allows one to determine individual learning abilities or differences or deficiencies. Thorndike's premise here is that the intelligence is permanently set before the student enters school. It is an easy conclusion, and it absolves educators from the responsibility for any of their students not learning. For if half the students in a classroom learn, that is proof enough that the teacher is teaching correctly. That the other half doesn't learn is obviously not the teacher's fault, as this half heard what the first half heard and experienced the same stimuli. There must be something wrong with the second half. A psychological test will determine what it is. Before 1900, the way to identify a good teacher was to determine that his students, at the end of their studies, knew a subject. With the emergence of psychological testing, however, teaching standards became dependent upon variables inherent in the nervous system of the children, and thus out of control of the teacher. The failure of many children to learn brings us to Thorndike's third point. He concluded that some students just won't make it, and that it's better to determine through educational testing who they will be early enough so that they can be shunted into useful vocational training. Here Thorndike reflects once again a synthesis of the revised psychology of wouldnt and the soft socialism of Dewey. When all facts are taken into account, we believe it will be found that the best interests of the individual and society will be served by providing a certain number of the pupils least gifted in intelligence with the equipment needed to begin their vocational career by the completion of their junior high school period or even earlier in a few cases. Other individuals will advance their own welfare and that of society by securing but one more year, others by two, others by 3 additional years. Thus, Although the great majority of children should spend some time in the junior high school, not all of them should be expected to continue to the completion of the senior high school course. Each child should have as much high school work as the common good requires. In summary, a German experimental psychologist was convinced that men are animals who can be understood by analyzing what they experience. His conclusions and methods were imported into an expanding American educational system and disseminated throughout that system to teachers, counselors, and administrators. Within half a century, juvenile delinquency would run rampant, illiterates would pour out of schools, teachers would no longer learn how to teach, and generation after generation of adults themselves cheated out of the fruits of a good education, would despair of any solution to the morass of modern education. Into chapter 4. Chapter 4 was long enough without me jumping in 100 times like I wanted to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a review of chapter 4 next.